Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast series brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. My name is Saeeduddin Faridi. I'm a research analyst here at ISAS, and I will be your host for today's episode on climate resilience in Indian cities. Cities are a vital part of the climate change and climate resilience conversation. Globally, cities contribute to over 70% of all greenhouse gas emissions. And at the same time, with the dense populations, cities are also very prone to the effects of climate change and the extreme weather events emanating from it. This brings climate resilience in cities to the forefront, which essentially entails building urban systems that can withstand an array of shocks and stresses emerging from climate change related issues. In this role, cities have also emerged as spaces of innovation, and across the world we are witnessing newer ideas, policies, technologies, and systems being deployed. And today, we will discuss these in the Indian context. And for that, we are delighted to have with us Ms Anumita Rouchowdhury, Executive Director of Research and Advocacy at the Center for Science and Environment in New Delhi. Ms Rouchowdhury, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
Climate resilience in Indian cities is a very important conversation to have while we are witnessing changing weather patterns and its impact on everyday life in urban areas. To contextualize our discussion today, my first question to you is why is the issue of climate resilience in Indian cities important, and what are some of the emerging issues?
Truly, it is really a scary story unfolding. And every time we experience extreme weather events, it's a grim reminder of the reality that confronts us today. So, we are and our cities today are devastated by climate extremes. In fact, a study that we did in 2022, we found that in India, the country experienced extreme weather events almost on 88% of the days from January to September. This is like virtually a day, that is some extreme weather event happening in some part of the country. Storms, cyclone, heat waves, floods. So all of that coming together. And we know from the IPCC reports that how cities are becoming more and more vulnerable. In fact, today already the climate data that exists with us, we know that in India particularly, that how temperature has increased, mean temperature is rising, and it is projected that by the end of the century, about 2.54 to 4.4 degree, Celsius rise that we are going to see. Now, what therefore this means for the cities, and keeping in mind that the urban population is growing, and in India with billion population, even if 40% of that are in urban centers, but that's huge, huge in absolute numbers. So their vulnerability to resource stress, to flooding, to heat stress, and the data that is emerging today is that most of the cities in India today are exposed to multiple climate risks. It's just not one. So it is the heat, rain, storms, flooding, everything. So, and then what we are saying today that it's not just that the people and the cities and the infrastructure and the cities are getting impacted, but also understand the equity impact of this and the disproportionate impact on the economically and socially marginalized urban communities and what it means for them. But keeping in mind that countries like India, like any other developing country city, you have large number of people living in informal settlements today and with low income and very little ability to mitigate and to adapt to the impacts. So therefore the social crisis associated with this change is going to be enormous. And so it's like at one level the economic and the social crisis, and today we know that if we do not plan and design our cities and urban settlements to be resilient, then not only the economic crisis is going to grow, the social crisis, the ecological crisis is going to grow, the vulnerability of the people and their ability to deal with it is also going to be hugely impacted, especially in the cities that we live in.
That is indeed very true, and thank you for sharing with us the data and fairly alarming data on the frequency of extreme weather events and the very important dimension of equitability. I think what we can talk about next is the state's approach to these issues. And we have seen sometimes in urban policy that there tends to be a top down approach where the central government announces urban initiatives, and with cities and urban local bodies then follow suit. And one example of this, and perhaps the most famous one too, is the Smart Cities Initiative, which was launched in 2015. And so, given the varied and diverse challenges that cities in India face, do you think that we need a rethink on approaching urban issues?
So, before I get into the actual policy, the planning that is happening to make cities resilient, let me also give kind of flag off the context of that what are cities experiencing that has implications and bearing on the way we are doing most of the urban planning or not doing our urban planning. So let us be clear that cities are both emitters of greenhouse gas emissions and also victims of climate change, which means that it actually builds the case for an urban planning approach that, while mitigating the emissions, will also strengthen the adaptive capacity of the cities. Now, but what we are seeing, and this is first, that what is the challenge for urban planning today? Very clearly, that we find is that the urban planning in most cases are disregarding the urban ecology and the natural drainage limits that are imposed on the planning and the urban development in the cities. So, what it means is that it's just not the climate change, but also the way we build our infrastructure, which is aggravating the impact of climate change. So we cannot control weather. We know that the temperature rising, extreme events can happen anytime. But what we can certainly deal with is that when we are building the infrastructure, we should be able to make that infrastructure resilient, and so which means that it's just not the temperature rising, but also keep in mind that all our development interventions, how that is also aggravating the climate change impacts. For instance, we all talking about temperature rise, the heat island effects in cities, but it is also because the concrete, the waste heat from the air conditioners, waste heat from the vehicles that we are driving, the glass facades on our building. Now, all of that are creating heat absorptive conditions, which is then aggravating the heat island effect. In fact, very recently we did some studies in about 10 cities of India, which is still going on. And we looked at the heat pockets where you observe more than 45-degree Celsius temperature. And when we analyze the factors that are locally responsible, for instance, the sky view factor, the openness, the blue and green, that is water and green, the vegetation, floor area ratio, the density of the development, it was so clear that the urban forms with less vegetation and water bodies have high temperature. And we also, but at the same time, we found that if there is 30% increase in effective vegetative cover, then it reduces the land surface temperature by 2 to 4 degrees. Now, these are big takeaway for what we have for urban planning, because we have done yet another analysis that shows that during summer, if you track the electricity consumption by the hour, especially in a city like Delhi, we were amazed to see that the peak demand for electricity during night time was actually higher than the afternoon peak. And the night time where all your institutions and retails and everything is closed, and yet the nighttime peak was higher than the daytime peak, simply because of lack of thermal comfort in our buildings. Dependence on air conditioners is increasing. Now, these are the very important takeaway, and also keeping in mind some of the notorious flood events that have happened, like the Chennai flood, Mumbai flood, Delhi flood, Gurugram flood. They are all testimony of the fact that how we are doing wrong urban planning in terms of drainage, how the drainage itself is working against the natural drainage patterns and the ecological niches in the cities. So, keeping that in mind and keeping this context in mind, we now need to understand the interventions that are happening to address it. So the current adaptation intervention, these are largely sectoral in nature. And when I say sectors, that means what are we doing with respect to the built environment, the buildings? What are we doing with mobility and transport, circularity or the waste management and water management and so forth? And in each sector, it is interesting to see that a lot of sectoral plans and policies have started to emerge, but larger approach is still very project specific. It's not a comprehensive long-term planning to address the adaptive capacity and resilience of the entire urban infrastructure. So the smart city program that we have today is a great opportunity. It has mobilized resources. It is bringing in new resources into the cities, the 100 smart cities. And you are seeing that lot of projects have taken off, and these are which have a bearing on the resilience of the city, like the lake rejuvenation, the canal corridor linear park developments. It is also around the treatment, the rooftop solar projects, the rejuvenation of water bodies, rainwater harvesting at a city scale. So large number of these programs are coming up, including waste management and circularity, where the municipal solid waste is being reutilized and they're generating biogas to run buses. So a lot of these interesting programs are taking off. But as I said, that the time has now come for us to do a lot more comprehensive planning. And because we need to address the adaptation deficit in our cities, because the physical infrastructure, the land use, the drainage, and the interconnectivity of the drainage with issues like stormwater drainage, water supply, wastewater, the treating of the water, water reuse, soil erosion, all of these will have to come together in an integrated framework. And when we start doing that, then we have to understand that each and every sector will require a lot more integrated planning, even though we do have now a lot of policies and building codes and standards coming up, which so they, from the adaptation perspective today, for instance, the building codes now need to look at the obstruction and the encroachment of the floodplains, or we need to design very uniquely for different urban basins, where we have to ensure that we have been able to reduce the surface runoff, retaining water through interception. We are doing and recharging the groundwater resources. Now there are policy mandates emerging to do that, but as I said, that it is not uniform across all cities and towns, keeping in mind that the bigger cities have one kind of challenge and the smaller towns have yet another kind of challenge, and we have to be looking at it. And while we need to speed up that action, we also have to contain some parallel developments which then undermine some of the positives that are happening. Like when we want to build compact, we want to bring people and distance and close down distances. But the urban sprawl that is happening today in our country, and in fact across South Asia, that clearly shows that the most of the urban population in the future will be living outside the municipal limits. And more of that happens, that means more and more people are going to be in a position who will be losing access to good services, to good connectivity, and that's further going to aggravate the situation. So urban planning is happening, a lot of positives are happening, more project oriented, but more integrated and comprehensive approach is needed today.
I think you raised some really interesting and important points in this answer because what we do end up seeing is that urban policy seems very responsive in nature, as it is always responding to crises and not engaging in a more long term sort of approach towards adoption. But I want to come to another element in urban policy which has been getting a lot of attention in India, and I'm referring to digital technologies here. So digitalization is seen as an efficiency tool and which can essentially improve the delivery of policy. How do you think that can be leveraged for improved outcomes in environmental sustainability and climate resilience in cities?
It's good to see that the science and technology evolving quite rapidly now, and digital technologies and their application, and there are pretty conscious moves that are also being made at the policy level for digitization, and all of these together, we expect that to contribute towards climate adaptation and for managing risks and impacts of climate change. So it's interesting to see, just to kind of give you some examples, that today how in India, we have adopted national cyclone risk mitigation projects, and that covers the coastal states. And this is all about early warning dissemination system for me, and more of that would also mean that it is helping us to develop mitigation infrastructure to inform that how do you do multi-purpose cyclone shelters, how do you do build your roads, how do you do saline embankments. So it's what is important that this data is increasingly being made available. So the early warning system, which for whether that's flood forecast, cyclone forecast, and location specific forecast. So we are being able to develop those that ability, and it has started to happen. And so now the question is that how do we take it forward and make it a more impact-based forecast so that you can identify the specific risk, improve dissemination of the information because it's just not the forecast but how people can access it quickly and the whole mobile dissemination that are being talked about, which is also happening, especially we have seen that working very well in the agricultural sector. And we need to, and but all of that have to come together to promote a lot of localized action plans that can be implemented following these forecasts. And also, we have to understand that one is where you're using digitization not only for climate, the forecast and early warning, but also for better urban planning. So, if you now do proper geospatial layers, to understand what kind of risk mapping that you need to do to guide investment plans, that would be important. And the fact that in India today, we have the whole opportunity emerging in the national policy for information technology and the leveraging of GIS decision support system for development. All of these can now be, and it is also happening to some extent, like for instance, for better management of forest and even for monitoring of urban forests, where you can do automated real-time digital monitoring. It's possible to do a smart meet. So for energy conservation and energy efficiency, the whole smart metering, building level automation system to control heating, cooling, lighting, appliances, all of that, which can also help us to keep track of our electricity consumption, water consumption, and in fact, it has been demonstrated that more we track the data digitally and we follow and track the consumption data, how that helps us to take better decision, and therefore almost 18 to 30% savings, resource savings, are possible because of that. Not only that, today the digital application is also helping us to plan better micromobility, shared mobility, smart water management. So this is happening, but we certainly want to see a lot more progressive action in the future. And even more important is that this will require massive digital skill building and capacity in the implementing bodies and also to be able to deliver digital services. and the data analytics skill, so that the vast amount of data that we are generating through digitization can also be create a good, the feedback loop, to be able to improve our interventions, policies, mitigation and adaptation strategies better and refine them better.
Thank you for that really insightful answer. And I think the future holds really interesting things in this policy intersection of digitalization and climate resilience. Coming to my final question of the podcast, given India's experience in climate resilience and urban policy, and drawing from experiences from the broader region in South Asia, what is the way forward for this intersection of urban and climate resilience?
So let us be very clear, given the challenge that confronts us, it certainly needs a new urban agenda. And that combines the strategy for mitigation and adaptation. We need to work on the principle of co benefit. Keep in mind that in the coming decades, there's going to be enormous investments in urban infrastructure. Now, if we do not link that up with sustainability, and we do not mainstream the indicators of sustainability in our investment plans, then it is going to be a missed opportunity. But if we do, then it's going to be an enormous opportunity to leapfrog to a much more sustainable paradigm. So, keeping that in mind, and just to give and to just explain that what I really mean for that way forward, is that the often we say that the built environment, or the buildings that India is going to have by the end of the next decade, almost 40% of those buildings have not yet been built. Now, if we are going to therefore be building so much and doing so much more new construction, now if in that we do not pay attention to thermal comfort, to choice of the right material that has less embodied energy, that if we do not plan the microenvironment properly, then we are going to lock in not only carbon in the infrastructure, but the infrastructure itself is also going to be a lot more vulnerable. So that's the kind of planning that we are looking for. Similarly, look at the opportunity in the mobility plans. The opportunity in India or in any developing country today is that even though we are in grip of massive motorization, with people becoming more and more dependent on personal vehicles, and yet today the majority of us actually travel by public transport, we walk, we cycle. Now, if we can therefore design our infrastructure not to be car centric, but that enables and supports walking, cycling, and public transit, then that means a lot of people will not shift from public transport to cars. And that's the intervention we require. In fact, in Delhi, it is said that after we build our entire metro and the mass transit system, almost 60% of Delhiites are going to be just within 400 meters from our transit system. Imagine the power of that opportunity. That if you then invest in accessibility, walking and cycling, then most of the people will just be able to access the transit very easily and not feel the need to use a car. That's the kind of opportunity that we have in India to avert the climate crisis. So, our regulations need to therefore understand the vulnerability. We need citywide data and assessment of vulnerability to plan for resilience. We need to strengthen our regulatory framework and infrastructure at the municipal level to enhance adaptive response. So, which means water resilience, circularity, sustainable mobility, energy efficiency, thermal comfort, all of that. Then we need to plan for disaster risk reduction mechanism in cities, because the infrastructure is becoming hugely vulnerable, must not go for wrong design. We need to improve even the migrant adaptive capacity, because our cities are so much vulnerable to migration and the poor people living in settlements. So, how do you make services available to them? You mitigate their risk. That's going to be a unique challenge for our cities, so that the adaptation and mitigation action in cities, while strengthening adaptation and the coping methods, should also be able to generate livelihood, jobs, and diversify income streams. And the mobility transition, as I said, is absolutely essential. And the city building itself has to be compact. We need to adopt a compact urban form so that we can keep the jobs and the home close, reduce distances, and reduce demand for travel and vehicle usage. We are inherently compact cities, but we have to contain the new sprawl. So all of these are needed today, and in which the urban poor and the land use planning will have to be integrated very explicitly, and we have to sensitize national and state level policies which can very explicitly adopt and adapt the indicators for climate resilience. So that's the way this is our. So even though we are talking about doom and gloom today, but I feel that the growth opportunities in India is an enormous opportunity to build differently, sustainably, and which is pro people. I think if that messaging goes out, then there's a huge learning, there's a huge opportunity in all the new positives that we are beginning to see. So that gives me the confidence that we can build right, and we can therefore avert a lot of the future crisis that we are expected to see with the climate change.
Thank you for highlighting these really important opportunities that lie ahead of us. And I think it also serves as a good note to end the conversation with, which began with a fairly grim picture of our shared future. Thank you so much, Dr. Rouchowdhury, for joining us in this conversation today and for your very detailed and data-oriented answers. I'm sure our listeners will find this conversation very engaging and informative.
Thanks, Shai. Thanks, Ramita. Nice meeting you, both of you.
Nice meeting you as well. You were listening to South Asia Chat. You can learn more about our work by visiting us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also get updates of our research and publications through social media. You can find us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram.